Hi, I'm Professor Tom O'Brien. Welcome to History 3380, World Civilizations since 1500. In the first half of Session 1, what I'd like to do is talk about the basic topics and themes that we're going to be covering in the course. And in the second half of Session 1, what I'll be doing is talking about some of the specific mechanics of the course, what exams are like, what grading is like, how to deal with reading assignments, and other such practical issues. But for the first part of this session today, what I want to do is talk about what's the course about. The title of the course, if it had been done more recently, probably would be something other than world civilizations. We tend to talk today more about world cultures rather than civilizations. Civilizations has a certain connotation in terms of civilized people versus uncivilized people, and most people in the world think of themselves as civilized. But more than that, there's the issue of, are we still dealing with multiple cultures? Or civilizations, if you want to use that term, or has the world become, or is it evolving into a single culture and civilization? And that's going to be one of the main themes that we'll be talking about over the coming weeks. Are we now in an era of global history? Are we now integrating our cultures and civilizations in that way? Certainly in the past, and we'll be looking briefly at the past in the early part of the course, in the centuries before the modern world, let's say before 1200 of the contemporary era, we could certainly speak of distinct civilizations and cultures around the world. There was minimal contact in the ancient world, although there was some, between civilizations in places like China and the Roman Empire, let us say. There was some minimal contact, but it was indeed minimal. There was limited knowledge of each other's languages, cultures, accomplishments. But over time, as we get into what is called the early modern world, starting about 1200, we see an intensifying interaction among the cultures and civilizations of the globe. We see what are called the early stages of globalization. And we're going to be tracing that process. And eventually, we get to the point around about 1700 of the contemporary era, where we can speak of a globalized society, a process of globalization that is rapidly advancing. So one of the keys issues here is, are we retaining our own identities of our distinct cultures? Whether we're from Asia, or whether we're from the Western Hemisphere, or Africa, wherever you might be from, are those cultures still distinct and discernible? Or are they becoming merged into a single culture? Everybody in the world wears some kind of high-priced sneaker these days, whether it's, whatever the brand name may be on it. We're all exposed to American cinema across the globe. Are we increasingly integrating cultures to such a degree that there will be few, if any, distinctions in the future? Now, as I said, in the past, it was very clear that there were distinct civilizations. China, Rome, Persia, all of these different civilizations had distinct languages and relatively limited contact with each other. There might be periodic warfare that would bring several of the great civilizations into clash with one another, but those were relatively rare types of events. Economic growth was relatively slow by our standards. These civilizations had evolved based on agriculture, the cultivation of crops, and the use of animals, beasts of burden, in order to cultivate those crops. This became the primary basis for the growth of states like Rome, the ancient empires of China, the Persian Empire, etc. Quite simply, the rulers of these various civilizations would tax peasants based on the agricultural and herding products that they would produce, whether it was sheep, cattle, etc., plus things like grain. These things would be taxed by the state, and that would provide the revenues for the development of these very elaborate states. Now, the fact is that, well, peasant agriculture became the basis across the world for the development of major state systems, because it was a reliable source of money. There's always food being produced, so there's always going to be something to be taxed. But despite that fact, the other reality is those types of economic activities, at least in the ancient world, don't grow very rapidly. This is not the type of economic activity which is going to generate huge amounts of revenues very quickly. They're great because they're reliable. They'll be there every year to tax them. You can tax them, abuse them, do all kinds of things to peasants, as was often done. But the part of it is, the fact is, they're not going to produce rapid increases in wealth. Why? Part of it was limits on technology. When we look at the types of technologies that are available at this time, oxen and basic types of plows, and gradual growing knowledge about fertilization, we realized that it wasn't going to be possible to rapidly expand agricultural production. Simply, the technologies weren't there. It also meant that these limits on technology meant limited trade over long distances. It is extremely expensive to move products over land for long distances. You can pack goods on a mule or a horse and carry them over long distances, but it's very costly to do so. It's a very slow kind of process. So long distance interchange, long distance trade was severely limited in the ancient world. Usually it was limited to very precious goods like silver, gold, diamonds, and other such precious metals and products, because it was so expensive to move products. Now, on the other hand, you can always go sailing. The movement of goods across the water is always much cheaper. It's always much cheaper to be moving products in a ship than on a horse, a mule, or a wagon, or whatever you might conceive of. However, it was hard to move goods across the water as well, any great distance, for the same reason: limited technologies. Ships are not very reliable. In the ancient world, you don't want to go sailing very far in the types of craft that existed. You don't want to go sailing into the ocean and run into a storm, because you're going to sink like a rock. These vessels were not highly seaworthy. Generally, when people went sailing in what we would call ocean-going vessels, they stayed within sight of the land, just in case things went badly. Another problem was navigation. How do you know where you are? Another reason for staying close to the land. You can at least see where you are. But if you're in the middle of the ocean, before the development of more elaborate technologies like astrolabes, etc., where you could shoot the stars and come up with some approximation of where you were, well, compasses are ancient, but okay, we know we're going north. Well, that's great, but we don't know what north means. We're in the middle of the ocean. We could be going to the polar ice cap for all we know. We just know we're going north. So a compass by itself isn't that much help if you're out in the ocean. So the technologies were also limited in that way. It was almost impossible for people to take long-distance voyages. If we think of thousands of miles as a long-distance voyage, or even 1,000 miles, traveling on the ocean. In the ancient world, very unlikely that you're going to do that kind of thing. So again, because of transportation technologies, there are acute limits on the ability to interact with other civilizations, even on simply an economic level of exchanging goods with them. Now, on the slide, I've suggested that the limitations on interactions between civilizations in the ancient world had its bad side and its good side. On the bad side was the fact that the general development of human societies in terms of what they could accomplish and achieve was rather limited. Even these powerful states that we think of, the ancient empires of Rome and of China, etc., they didn't do anything near what modern states do in terms of how they affected their civilizations. There were no public education systems. You couldn't, everybody didn't go to school. Hardly anybody went to school. It was unlikely that there was any kind of centralized police force to enforce the law. As far as welfare, you're a starving peasant? Gee, that's too bad. We don't account for that. Because states had very limited capabilities, very limited economic resources. So this was the downside of this lack of interaction, this minimalized interaction in the ancient world. The good side was the fact that they couldn't have that much interaction. And I say that's a good side for this reason. Something that we're going to look at as a major topic in the early part of the course is that limited interaction means you can't spread germs in any significant or rapid way. As you know, sitting in a classroom, one of the great dangers for you to contract, let's say, the flu, nothing serious like the bird flu maybe, but the flu or other diseases, is the fact you're sitting around other human beings who are crawling with germs, much as you are, but they may have different germs than you have and infect you. So it's that intense exposure to other human beings that makes the transmission of most diseases possible. In the ancient world, yes, there would be plagues and epidemics, but they would be limited to a particular region and usually no larger than a given political entity, an empire or a state of some kind. But as the world evolved, as societies evolved, and we will follow this process in the course, and people began interacting more intensively, it made it possible for disease to spread much more rapidly over vast distances. In the 13th and 14th centuries, something called the Black Death was going to show up in the far northern reaches of Asia. And very quickly it was going to spread down through Asia, across India, through the Middle East, and into Europe, and kill millions and millions of people. Why? Because there were transportation routes now that rapidly moved goods across those vast distances. And along the way, they happened to bring along some fleas who were carrying the Black Death and wound up killing millions of people. So as interactions accelerate, as technologies improve, there'll be benefits for the economies of various societies, but there are also risks and dangers, particularly questions of epidemic and pandemic, meaning a very broadly based epidemic. Just as today, we all realize that the development of avian flu in certain parts of the world is an immediate danger to the entire world, because if that disease does effectively transfer from birds to human beings, it will only take a couple of affected human beings getting on planes and flying to New York or Moscow to spread the disease around and maybe kill half the planet. But we'll worry about that later. Try not to be concerned much. Okay. Moving beyond the ancient world with these limitations on technology, the limited interactions among people, the time we're really going to focus on after the first couple of weeks is the evolution of modern global history. And we start back around 1200 of the contemporary era. And roughly, and historians disagree, if you had 5 historians in the room, they'd come up with 5 different sets of dates for you. But these particular dates are the ones that I'm using. Roughly from 1200 to 1700 of the contemporary era is what I would call the early modern world. And from the period after that, 1700 on, what we would term the modern world. As to why the specific distinctions I'm interested in are the developments of globalization over time, and you'll see as we go on why I would choose these particular dates. First of all, 1200 became important because of something that we're quite familiar with today, although the sources may be very different. And that is a changing climate. Now, there were no smokestacks spewing out various carbon products back then, but the Earth's climate did periodically, down through its history, undergo significant change. One such change was a period of cooling weather from 300 to 800 of the contemporary era, and then a warming cycle from 800 to 1200. So what? So the warming cycle had a profound effect on interactions between human beings. Even though these changes are very subtle, even today it's a matter of, well, this year is 1 degree warmer than 2 years ago. Even though the changes are subtle, they can have profound effects. One of the effects was to alter the relationships between nomadic and agrarian people. Nomadic people are people whose culture is based on significant movement. Often these are people who are hunters and gatherers, people who graze animals and move on a regular basis, such as the Plains Indians of North America, following bison. These are nomadic groups. Agrarian societies are the more typical ones that we're familiar with because they were the basis of the major civilizations, the sedentary populations whose economies were based largely on agriculture. Now, relationships between sedentary and nomadic people have varied through the centuries. Sometimes they're peaceful. They produce goods that they exchange with each other. Nomads often have horses or various grazing animals that they can exchange for agricultural products. But other times they would war on each other. Sedentary people looking for more land, nomadic people simply looking to take some goods from sedentary people. What happened in this era, though, as the warming cycle proceeded, is that nomadic groups began to expand. Their numbers began to increase. And they began looking for expanded territories to occupy to graze their animals and support their populations, because they need widespread areas. You need a lot of room to be grazing animals. This meant nomadic incursions against sedentary people became more frequent. And often they became very large and very violent. And here, on the slide where it says nomadic invasions, I've listed a few of the more memorable examples of nomadic peoples who engaged in invasions of sedentary regions. The Vikings in Europe. The rise of Islam in the Middle East was led in no small part by the nomadic tribal groups on the Arabian Peninsula, who spread out and helped create an Islamic culture that stretched across North Africa, through the Middle East, all the way into Asia. The Turks, tribal nomadic groups that entered into the Middle East and created some of the great empires of the world during the early modern era. And the Mongols, nomadic peoples from north of China who invaded China, eventually conquered China, and created, at one time, the largest land-based empire in the world. Stretched all the way from the Pacific coast of China all the way to the eastern portions of Europe. A vast imperial system. Didn't last for very long, but it was enormous in its scope. So something as simple as a few degrees in climate change helps set off these mass movements by nomadic peoples and leads to these invasions, and also, importantly for us, leads to the creation of new kinds of empires. In the next slide, I'm talking about these new empires, such as the one that I just mentioned, the Mongols, who conquered China in 1279. Another empire created by nomadic people was the Mamluk Empire in Egypt in 1260. See how these dates are all kind of related to each other. The Ottomans, who were Turks, who penetrated into what we term the Middle East today, who first founded their imperial system about 1280. In Europe, we see the rise of warrior states that evolved from nomadic groups invading Europe in the centuries after the collapse of the Roman Empire. Two such warrior states that were emerging by about 1000 of the contemporary era were Spain and Portugal. So we have a series of new states that are being created in the world that have their origins in these mass movements of nomadic people, which in turn was triggered by something as seemingly simple as a change in climate. Now, these states are going to represent, in some ways, a fusion of their nomadic origins and their sedentary origins. They are going to have the resources of large, dense populations, the agricultural civilizations that they conquered, and they're also going to possess considerable skills at warfare because of their nomadic past. For example, the Mongols, who were phenomenal horsemen because of their nomadic culture and economy, allowing them to expand with rapid military movements as a result of those skills. Out of this fusion, out of these new warrior states, comes a new form of empire, which is far more dynamic than the empires of the ancient world. They combine new technologies, and when I say new, I mean technologies that have actually been around for several centuries or more, but now they're being used in new combinations. Adapted technologies combined with expanded trade and the development of even more intense military power. Basically, the way it works is this. I have new technologies. I have better weapons. I have new skills, such as horsemanship, and I use those to attack other groups and expand my empire. Now, in the old days, that would have been it. You seize new territories, and then you tax another group of peasants. But one of the things about these newer technologies, like astrolabs and other, greater knowledge of ocean currents be another one, one of the effects of the new technologies was to allow increased trade, especially ocean-going trade. Now, seamen over the centuries had acquired knowledge of how ocean currents worked. They were able to better steer and navigate their vessels. They had better technologies to do that. The vessels themselves were more efficient, with rudders and new types of sails. What this means is that rather than just conquering another group of peasants and taxing them, what you do now is go out and use your conquest to expand your trading relationships with much of the rest of the world. In fact, a focal point for these empires was the idea of expanding trade, and that meant controlling trade routes. If I can dominate, let us say the Ottomans wanted to dominate the Mediterranean Ocean, they're going to have to compete with the Habsburg Empire in Spain to do that. But each side is looking for the same thing. We want to control those trade routes. Why? Because trade allows you to increase your wealth much more rapidly than simply peasant agriculture. It's got high risks, but you can reduce the risk by seizing control of the trade routes. Suddenly, you can vastly increase the revenues that the state can receive in a given year, because now you're focusing more and more on expanding trade. And trade can grow with great rapidity, especially with the new technologies allowing long-distance shipping to go on. Now you can get more money. So you can buy more weapons, so you can attack more people, so you can expand trade, so you can have more money to buy more weapons, and so on. So we get into a cycle where these empires, and again, going back here and looking at the slide, with the Ottomans, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Mughals, who were a group related to the Mongols. The Mughal Empire was in India. And eventually the British and the French. All of these different groups represent types of trading empires that emerge after 1200 of the contemporary era, especially by 1400, 1500 of the contemporary era. All of these vast trading empires are in place. Spain has huge possessions in the Western Hemisphere. Portugal has a trading empire that stretches across Africa all the way to China. These are vast trading networks that these states create. They are the most powerful empires that had existed in the world up to that time. Now, one other example that sort of fits is China. The Mongols, after about a century of rule, were overthrown, and rule by the Chinese themselves was reestablished under the Ming Dynasty. But I've got a question mark after the Ming, because as all these other empires were doing these dynamic things of expanding and seizing new areas, China began, for complex reasons, too complex to go into today, but China began to draw in upon itself. Now, it's a slow, subtle process. If you looked at the world in 1500 and wanted to rank empires, what's the most powerful empire in the world, etc., China would still, as of 1500, be number one. It represented a huge domestic market. It had an enormous economy. Second would probably be the Ottoman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean. But China was still, by far and away, number one. But as these other empires are reaching out, growing, adding new routes, expanding their military forces, battling with each other for control of trade routes in the Pacific Ocean, in the Mediterranean, etc., China was starting to ossify. It was starting to slow up. It wasn't looking to reach out and expand with the same kind of dynamism that these other empires were. So in a way, it fits this pattern. But just as all these other empires are continuing to accelerate their growth and their power, China is leveling off. And eventually, the other empires are going to surpass it, and China will find itself a target of aggression by some of the new trading empires that have emerged. But here we have, by 1500, a radical change in the course of human history. No longer do we have these splendidly isolated empires dotting various parts of the world. Now we have a series of empires that are almost in constant interaction with each other, usually busy slaughtering each other. But nevertheless, they are definitely interacting on a large-scale basis. They are controlling vast trading networks. They come to control the lives of millions of people around the world. This is certainly another major step in what becomes known as globalization. Now, what were the sinews of empire, as I have on this slide? What made it possible for these societies to do what they did? Well, some of the things I've already mentioned. Compasses, the use of compasses. Now, compasses were in existence in the ancient world. But the point is, their use had become widespread by the early modern age. Gunpowder. Again, gunpowder was developed in ancient China, but increasingly knowledge about it, how to make it, how to use it, spread around the globe. The use of gunpowder-fired cannons becomes a critical part of warfare at sea. Certainly up through the 1500s, the way ships attacked each other was basically you got up alongside another vessel, some of your crew jumped onto the other vessel, and then you hack the other crew to death with knives and hatchets and things like that. Unless they decided to surrender. That was naval warfare. Gruesome, but but very minimalist in terms of its technologies. But of course, once gunpowder is invented and once cannon become on common use, one of the keys to the Portuguese Empire, for example, was their development of ships that had portals where they could stick cannon out of. Up until that time, people had basically put a couple of cannon on the deck of a ship. Now, large numbers of cannon are being used aboard ships, and you can wreak incredible damage upon another sailing vessel from a good distance by firing these cannon. Now, you don't have to be terribly accurate. Most of the time they weren't firing cannonballs, they'd fire shrapnel. You know, they just stick all kinds of metal into the cannon and then shoot it at you, and you know, they just killed whatever was standing there. Again, gruesome, but more efficient. But also, naval vessels could also, with this power of cannons, bring down city-states in ports, great ports that controlled important trade routes, could be attacked and subjugated without ever landing any troops of any significance, just by using your cannon to reduce the port to rubble, to destroy its fortresses and to generally intimidate its population. So the use of gunpowder, and particularly in the form of cannons, could have widespread effect, made it possible to really extend the military power of civilizations at this time, the new trading empires. Another one that I've listed here is sails. Doesn't seem very important, except the fact that by the 1500s, Europeans and others had caught on to the use by Arab sailors of triangular sails. Instead of using a square sail, where you have to count on the wind coming up behind you and blowing you to your destination. What happens when the wind's blowing in the wrong direction? I don't know. You don't go anywhere. But with a triangular sail attached to a boom, you could swing the sail around, the wind would catch it and help push you in the direction you wanted to go, no matter which way the wind was blowing. Going back to the slide again, another factor that's important, and that's another form of technology really, because what technology is knowledge, was knowledge of ocean currents and prevailing trade winds. If you know where these currents move and you know when winds are blowing in a certain direction, you can get just about any place in a sailing vessel. If you don't know, you could well die just 100 miles from shore because you can't fight these currents sufficiently to move your vessel where you want to go. If you're sailing north and the ocean current is moving south, you're going to move about as fast as a crab in terms of getting across the water. So this knowledge of where ocean currents moved, in what direction, when trade winds blew in certain directions, was accumulated gradually over the centuries, and by the early modern period was being put to good use for the expansion of trade around the globe. Now, even though these trading empires are vast and these technologies are greatly advanced, still, ships were small. I mean, if you think of, if you've been down to Corpus and seen, you know, the recreations of the Nina, the Pinta, etc., they're little things. And that was a typical sailing vessel in the 15th century. So it's not like you can afford to be shipping, let's say, bricks across the Atlantic. You're not going to make much money shipping bricks. So you have to rely still, as in the ancient world, on precious goods. Things like spices, silks, silver, gold, and another precious commodity that became of increasing importance to the trading empires, human beings. As slavery, which had existed throughout most of human history, suddenly became a major part of the international commerce of the globe. But all of these goods had in common the fact that per unit they bore very high prices. They were precious products. So with just one shipload of, let us say, spices coming from the far Pacific, you could create a fortune for dozens of people, fortunes that would last them their entire life and several generations beyond in just one small vessel, because the product is so precious. Given the size of ships and what were still considerable risks in sailing across the ocean, trade tended to focus on those kinds of products. Now, what also happened is that, of course, these empires engaged in massive combat with each other to try to compete for these trade routes. The ideal situation was to monopolize the trade. If it was trade between, let us say, Europe and China, trade between Europe and the Americas, wherever it was, what each of these empires was trying to do to reduce risk and increase profit was to eliminate the competition and establish a monopoly so only they could control that trade. The Portuguese tried this with the trade in the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. They never succeeded, of course, and neither did any of these other empires, but they spent a good deal of treasure and blood trying to do precisely that, to control the trade routes and monopolize them. Okay, going to the next slide, looking at the development of the empires from the perspective of interactions between human beings. In the early period of these interactions, what we're dealing with are encounters. The Portuguese visiting Africa, the Portuguese arriving in India, the Spanish exploring the Americas, particularly in the Caribbean basin, where oftentimes initial contact involved the exchange of goods and some knowledge, perhaps bringing people back from the area that had first been encountered, exposing them to European societies. The trading empires, and there were many of them that existed in the Indian Ocean, using the Europeans to enhance their own trade by adding more vessels, more goods to the mix of the complex trade patterns that existed in the Indian Ocean. This is fairly typical of what happened in the Western Hemisphere, Africa, India, China. The initial contacts were essentially contacts of equals. When the Portuguese first arrived in India, they came in these ocean-battered ships. They had been sailing for months. They're on the verge of starvation. They were not there to conquer anybody. What they needed was a drink of water and something to eat. However, in the Western Hemisphere, this process of simple encounter changed dramatically as the Spanish, realizing certain advantages that they enjoyed over the populations in the Western Hemisphere, used their military superiority, their control of steel-based weapons, things like swords, cannon, gunpowder, devices of not only cannons but small arms, to impose their will on a population that was at least somewhere between 25 and 50 million people that lived in the Western Hemisphere. So at least in that instance, as these encounters took place, as the trading empires grew, in the Western Hemisphere at least, this led to a massive conquest of populations. Partly because of technological differences, but also because, and we will see this when we get to talking about disease in the early modern world, because the Europeans bore diseases for which the inhabitants of the Western Hemisphere had no resistance. We'll see why that was true. But disease suddenly became of massive importance, and in fact, 90% of the population of the Western Hemisphere would be destroyed by disease in 150 years' time. But that proved to be the exception through the early part of this history of the trading empires. As these empires competed, the Ottomans and the Habsburgs and the Portuguese, etc., in places like Africa and the Indian Ocean, it was that, a competition. And the Europeans, in many cases, were often the weaker partners in these encounters because they were stretching their technologies to the limit. They had to sail all the way along the west coast of Africa, up the east coast of Africa, and then across the Indian Ocean to get to many of these places. And by the time they did that, they had exhausted many of their resources. Usually a third or 40% of the crews would die before they even got to the Indian Ocean. So these early encounters, most of them are that, encounters. But that would begin changing. If we go back to the slide, you'll see that By the 18th century, the Europeans enter into a period of colonial expansion, where some of the traditional trading empires go into severe decline, such as China under the Ming Dynasty, the Ottoman Empire, which begins to weaken, and the European trading empires, particularly the British and the French, begin asserting a control over vast portions of the world, including most of Africa, India, and China, although China technically doesn't become a colony. Nevertheless, for a period, roughly from the middle of the 18th century till almost the middle of the 20th century, Europeans were able to assert their power over much of the rest of the world. Now, how that happened, why it happened specifically, again, we're going to look at this issue as well. How does colonialism arise? How is it that the West, at least for a time, is able to assert that power over so much of the world's population? However, that period would still be relatively brief. The Europeans have largely completed their colonial expansion by the beginning of the 20th century. And within 50 years, the empires would be falling apart. Much of the history of the second half of the 20th century is the history of the disintegration of these colonial empires and the rise of independent nations out of the ruins of those imperial systems in Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world, the Middle East, etc. Now, what set off the end of the European colonial empires? If we go back to the slide, you'll see that, first of all, the Europeans essentially committed suicide. World War I and World War II, the Europeans threw themselves into these fratricidal wars, destroying their own military machines, much of their own populations, devastating their own economies. By the end of World War II, England, which had been the premier imperial power of the world, the world's #1 financial power, the world's leading naval power, the world's leading industrial power, by the end of World War II, England was a wreck. In 1947, people in England were freezing to death in their homes because of a severe winter when there was not enough coal. This, the greatest empire in the history of the world, could not keep its own people warm at the end of World War II. So war vastly diminished the powers of the leading European states. A second factor that weakened the imperial systems was the Great Depression. The Great Depression, which erupted, at least in American terms, in 1929 and persisted at least until the beginnings of World War II in 1939, a decade where the world's economy seemed to collapse. Industrial production collapsed, world trade collapsed. This had equally devastating consequences throughout the European world, undermining these great imperial systems. Those factors contributed to the end of colonialism, as the European states were simply unable to hold on to what they had, but was also complicated by the rise of resistance movements throughout the colonized world. As we will see in Africa and India and Asia, people had rallied together, organized to resist European domination and control. And eventually they were able to mobilize and fight against European control, and that, combined with the disasters that had affected European power, led to the national liberation movements that spread across about 2/3 of the world after the end of the Second World War. However, that was not the end of dominant power in the world. Europe had essentially destroyed itself in 2 wars. Not that it couldn't rebuild, but as the dominant group of world powers, that had ceased to be the case by the end of World War II. On the other hand, the United States of America was emerging, and had definitely emerged by the end of the Second World War, as the dominant power in the world. If England had slipped into decline, the United States had been moving in the opposite direction in that same period during the late 19th and the first half of the 20th century. We've talked about trading empires of the early modern world, the colonial empires of later centuries. The United States was a new kind of empire. It didn't create a vast chain of colonies with colonial governors. This was an empire based far more on economic power and far more on the idea of promoting vast interaction among the cultures and economies of the globe. This had been an American focus throughout the late 19th and indeed throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. The United States was anxious to spread its ideas and its economic system. Use of military force? Sure. But not with the purpose of acquiring vast territories, as had the colonial empires of the past, and not for the purpose of creating trade monopolies, as had been the purpose of the trading empires of the early modern world. If we go back to the slide, you'll see that one of the keys in the development of the United States in this regard was the Second Industrial Revolution, which took place at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. Essentially, what happened is that the United States, before any other major power, experienced a rapid progression in its industrial growth. Most of this came because of the application of scientific discoveries to the industrial process. Electricity, seems simple enough, can have huge consequences for productivity in factories. The development of continuous process production, assembly line production, the development of chemicals, industrial chemicals. These processes, along with scientific management, the idea of analyzing how people work in order to find ways to get them to work more efficiently or replace them with a machine, mechanization. Scientific management also contributed to this vast increase in productive power. You go in and study how you work. Okay? Say you're working at Starbucks. They watch you and they measure every movement you make at the latte machine. You know, doing this, push this, here's the steam. And they either tell you, after a careful engineering analysis of what you've been doing, how to do it more efficiently, or they tell you, guess what, kid? We figured out how to do this with a machine. Bye. That's scientific management. Mechanization. These powers together allowed the United States to become the dominant industrial power of the world. By the early 20th century, the United States was the leading industrial power in the world. And it accomplished that partly through the Second Industrial Revolution and this enormous productivity capability, but also because it had the largest internal market in the world. That doesn't mean it had more people. What it means is it had more people who were buying stuff. Now, this didn't get all done nice and neatly. Gee, we had the Second Industrial Revolution, now we're producing more stuff and people are buying more stuff. Because, in fact, a problem arose that even with the vast size of the American economy, goods were often being produced far more rapidly than they were being absorbed. So, a solution had to be found. And part of that solution came in the form of consumerism. If you go back to the slide, you'll see that a critical factor in all of this is the development of the concept of consumerism. Now, when you say that, people often feel like, oh, well, but we've had consumers, you know, people have been consuming stuff all the way back to those ancient empires I was talking about earlier. So, you know, okay, so they're still consuming stuff. But consumerism is different. Consumerism isn't just people buying something or exchanging one product for another. Yes, that has gone on probably since, you know, the beginnings of human society, since there were more than a couple of people around. You know, you got a rock, I got a stick. Here, I'll swap you the stick for the rock. Technically, we're consuming stuff, but the reason why do I want the stick, or why do you want the rock? Well, see, I have this squirrel over here, and I want to have him for lunch, but you know, I don't want to get bitten, so I need a rock, you know, to hit him on the head with. Then I can have him for lunch. So I want the rock because I need it for my sustenance. And this is most of the kind of exchange that has gone on in the world down through the millennia, down through thousands of years, is people consuming goods, producing goods that were needed. But consumerism suggests that there are other things that you need that are not really part of human necessity. An iPod, for example. Do you really need an iPod? Of course I need an iPod. I need something to listen to while this idiot is up there lecturing. I gotta have it. You know? Why? Because it makes me happy. You know, I enjoy it. It helps me relax. Okay, but will you starve to death tomorrow? Will your heart stop beating? Well, it might, but it probably has nothing to do with an iPod. Consumerism is the idea of linking consumption of goods and services to human happiness. That this is the way to achieve essentially a paradise on earth is through the consumption of goods. And in late 19th century, early 20th century America, this idea took on vast importance. The development of department stores, where people would be, you know, it wasn't just a grocery store. You know, it wasn't just the local general store anymore with a bunch of cans stacked up, you know, okay, give me 2 brown cans for lunch and I'll take a green can for dinner. You know, industrial goods that were largely undistinguished from each other. No, a department store offered you a display of the wonders of the world. Electric lighting to light up the display cases, attractive displays of clothing, displays of entire rooms of furniture. That's not just a bunch of chairs stacked up that you pick one from. No, here's a dream of what your house can look like. You know, with this lovely chair and the piano over there, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, that's it. That's for me. And beyond the department stores came advertising agencies to spread these ideas more broadly, to appeal to people's inner desires. The basic idea is you're not selling the product, you're selling the happiness that the product will bring. And it's quite evident today just how successful consumerism has been. I mean, take time to look at advertisements. You don't have to take time, you can't escape them. But typical media ads. Let's say they're selling a car or a house or beer or all three at once. What are they selling? I mean, they're not really selling you the beer. They're selling you a beach party. Oh, all these scantily clad people are getting together and having a great time, and they're all guzzling beer. It's not about the beer, it's about the happiness, that the beer is linked to the happiness. That's what it's about. So too, if you buy a house, you're not buying a house to put your kids in or your spouse, you're buying happiness. Watch an ad for a housing developer sometime. It's not a practical matter of, we use the best quality wood, and because we don't. We have 100-year shingles on the place. No, we don't. 5 years is all you'll get. We don't talk about those things. What we talk about is we show you an image. You just bought the house. You arrive with your spouse. The kids get out of the car. They're ecstatic. Happy, happy. You just bought happiness, whether it's in the form of a house, a car, an iPod. This was the concept of consumerism. And it became central to America's position in the world and how America spread its influence. What one scholar has called the irresistible empire. And why she called it that was because, as much as Americans have used military force, and we will see some of that in the course as well, nevertheless, most of American influence has come from the incredible appeal of what American society is about this world of perpetual wealth, about a world that can produce an enormous array of material goods. And it isn't just piling them up, it's bringing you happiness, that this is how you can truly enjoy yourself. And not only can you enjoy these things, not only will they bring you happiness, you can change yourself. You don't have to be who you are. You don't have to be overweight. We'll get a little vacuum pump and pump it out of you. Or we'll put a band around your digestive system so you can't eat. But we can do it for you. We can fix you. You can buy smaller. You want children? You can't have children. I understand. That's all right. You can buy some. We have a service. We call it fertility services, but you can buy that. So you can be a parent when before you couldn't be. You want to find someone to love. We can do it for you. Okay? We can get you online, eHarmony. Here you go. We can find that service for you. We can bring you human happiness. And we can change you. You will be a different person. Think about what you wear on a day-to-day basis. I know, if you're like me, you really don't think about it. It's whatever in the closet. But most people in the modern world, in this society, and now more and more other societies, are very conscious of what they wear. Because, as the ads say, you're making a statement about who you are. What kind of slacks do you wear? What kind of sneakers? What kind of t-shirt? You go to the gym, okay? I go to the gym and stuff that has paint stains on it. But everybody else there has got, Nike, whatever, this kind of sneaker and that kind of shorts, etc. I'm usually mistaken for a janitor. What's that guy doing here? He's not dressed for the gym. Why? Because you have to define yourself, and you define yourself, you can change yourself. Okay, maybe I'm not athletic, but if I put on a pair of sweats and a fashionable t-shirt and some high-priced sneakers, I can look like I'm an athlete. I can look like, I'm part of, the new generation. So you can not only find happiness, you can change yourself in the process. All of this is a part of American culture and society, and it has been enormously successful. When we talk about globalization, at least when we talk about it in this course, we're not going to talk about it just as, we went back and we saw how these trading empires developed and how cultures interacted, and that's all part of it. But it's more than that. the 20th century and the 21st century's version of globalization, this growing interaction between cultures and economies and nation states around the world, is very much driven by what this society accomplished in the past 200 years. Much of what people see as globalization, this opening up of world economies, this vast investment in modern technologies, communication systems, and most of all, ideas of consumerism and what constitutes a happy life, a meaningful life. And indeed, how do we evaluate other societies? Think about it when people talk about the world. How do you evaluate other human societies? What do you think of them? Almost inevitably, we talk about developed and underdeveloped. And what does developed mean? Developed means you look a lot like we do here, with an industrial or post-industrial society, a consumer society, culture, and a consumer economy. If you don't have that, or the degree to which you don't have it, then you are considered to be lower down on the scale. Most of us carry around in our heads, whether we think about it consciously or not, this image of the world. What's developed? What does it mean to be a highly developed and prosperous society? It means to have many of the accoutrements that are typical or characteristic of the United States, particularly American consumer culture. If you can't watch American movies, if you can't listen to American music, if you can't wear sneakers that are like ours at least, where you at? What kind of society is that? So this whole process of globalization has been vastly influenced by the rise of the United States as the world's leading power. Much of what we call globalization today is the expression of what Americans have seen as their mission to influence much of the rest of the world with their own culture. And they have done so far more profoundly than any empire of the ancient or early modern world. We have had a far greater, more penetrating effect on the rest of humanity than any of these empires of the past. Now, on the other side, if we go back to the slides, well, globalization is certainly triumphant in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. There's also the fact that this whole process of change and advancement, modernization, development, is not without its problems. As societies have entered into this process of rapid change, capitalist development, consumer societies, etc., as that has happened, there have been a variety of reactions. It has not all been, oh, well, everyone wants to be like this, everyone wants to mimic or absorb Western and then later American systems of belief, American and European economic systems. One thing that we're going to be looking at is the rise of 20th century revolutions. The first half of the 20th century was rocked by revolutions that swept much of the world. The Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, revolutions in places like Vietnam, Central America, Cuba. And those events, as we will see, are related to this whole process of globalization. As the world has set upon this path of transformation, many societies have found themselves severely disrupted by that process of change. And it's led to radical reactions, such as these revolutions. In other cases, we have had other types of extreme reaction, such as the rise of fascism in Europe, the Nazis. Although we normally think of things like revolutionary movements and fascism as being very different, they are connected in a very real way as processes that are linked to societies trying to adapt to the vast, rapid, sweeping changes that have affected the world over the past few centuries. The rise of modern societies, modern economies, a globalized world. Something else that we'll be looking at that represents a reaction to this process is what I mentioned earlier, anti-colonialism. The rise of the colonial states was in part an element in this process of globalization. The emergence of anti-colonialism represented a reaction by people who, while they might well aspire to the same kinds of material accomplishments as they could see in places like Europe and America, rejected the domination that came with that in terms of the creation of the European colonial empires. More recently, in our lifetime, in the contemporary world, we have seen vast movements of anti-globalization. Now, anti-globalization isn't just some people demonstrating against liberalizing international trade. It isn't just demonstrations that occur when the leading economic powers, the group of 8, like Japan and Germany and the United States, etc., meet and we have protests about economic policy. There's far more to that than simply protests about economic policy. There is, in the world today, often a reaction to this whole idea of the influence of the West and the influence of the United States as a part of the globalization process. We don't have to look very far to see that. Try Iraq. Many cultures, Islam among them, have reacted to what we often see as sort of an ideal set of values, an ideal way of shaping the world, have often reacted against a process which they see as threatening to their cultures, threatening to their societies. What we often see as an ideal world of consumer wealth, of societies where all types of cultural experimentation are possible, these kinds of ideas are often seen as a very real threat in other cultures. So the reaction to globalization is more complex than just disputes over economic policy. It has a great deal to do with how societies see themselves and how they conceive of their own futures and how they see themselves fitting or not fitting into the world around them. And it isn't just in the form of direct and overt rejection. Other people have taken more subtle approaches of trying to interact with the forces of globalization. Sometimes it isn't just overt rejection. For example, as American consumer products have spread around the world, they have often been absorbed into other cultures and then reinterpreted, reimagined. I'll give you an example. The most successful consumer product ever created in the United States, up until at least very recently, was Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is everywhere. And Coca-Cola means certain things to us. Lots of sugar, caffeine. Coca-Cola is very much identified with American consumer culture, with the idea of leisure time activity, having a good time, being prosperous enough to have free time to enjoy things like this. But there are other uses for Coca-Cola. So when we see Coca-Cola being consumed elsewhere, it doesn't always mean that people are, yes, buying into our ideas. For example, shamans in Mexico, religious healers, use Coca-Cola to drive out evil spirits. Not exactly what they had in mind. They said Coke is it. Sure, it's still Coca-Cola, but it's not, for the indigenous shamans, that's not the way they see it. They see it as a potion that is capable of healing people spiritually. One of the fastest growing religious movement among Christian populations is Pentecostalism. As we're going to see in the course, one of the reasons Pentecostalism has spread so rapidly in places like Latin America and Africa is because, in a very real way, it's helping people to try to cope with the vast changes brought in their lives by globalization. So reactions to globalization can be vast and complex, from revolutions to fascism to Islamic political movements to Pentecostal religious movements to reinterpreting and reimagining what American consumer products mean. That brings us back, finally, to this issue of, well, where are we at then? I started at the beginning by saying, well, look at, we clearly have distinct civilizations and cultures in the ancient world. Then we see the rise of trading empires, increasing integration of societies, the creation of the colonial empires of the 19th century when the West dominated most of the world's territory and populations. Then we see this vast wave of globalization as economies are opened up to foreign trade and investment at a speed which simply couldn't have been imagined 50 or 100 years ago. But in all of this, are we indeed creating a single global culture? Are we becoming a single people, if you will, who largely share common values, common ideals? Well, you would certainly think so to watch most of the popular treatments of globalization today, when we see how rapidly telecommunications can spread ideas, when we see how rapidly products circulate around the globe. But this is by no means a settled issue, because, as we will see, people are not simply buying wholesale into the process of globalization, into the process of economic, cultural, or even political change. There are complex reactions. So hopefully by the time we get to the end of the course, we'll have a reasonable idea of, well, what is emerging in the world today? What are all these processes about? How is it that we can indeed link ideas like, or phenomena like revolutions and fascism and consumerism, the rise of certain types of religious movements, that all of these are somehow related to a complex process going on in the world and changing our lives, changing the way we see ourselves and the way the world around us functions. Is this, in fact, going to lead to the creation of a single, relatively uniform global culture? Or in fact, are we just going through a phase? Will these kinds of conflicts and challenges to this process continue down through the centuries? Will we remain distinct civilizations? Will this course still be properly titled 50 years from now World Civilizations or World Cultures? Or would it just be Global History? Because we're all kind of alike. We're going to explore that as a central issue in the weeks to come. Thanks very much. We'll be back next time to talk about course mechanics.